The definability of nothingness is one of the most fundamental and, at the same time, most problematic conceptual issues encountered by human thought. This is because the human mind, by its very nature, operates by grasping things, delimiting them, determining their qualities, and making them distinguishable from others. From this perspective, the act of definition can be seen as the mind's attempt to establish order. In order to cope with uncertainty, human beings create concepts. Through these concepts, they make sense of the world, classify it, and transform it into a structure that appears manageable and controllable. However, when it comes to nothingness, this mechanism becomes dysfunctional from the very beginning. To define something means to be able to speak about it, to give it a name, and to include it within the domain of thought. This process requires that what is defined have a corresponding representation in the mind. Yet nothingness refers precisely to a condition in which such a representation does not exist, and, in fact, should not exist. For this reason, any attempt to define nothingness generates a contradiction from the very first step. While everything that is defined acquires a form of existence on the level of thought, nothingness rejects this very status of being. This contradiction also explains why nothingness cannot be grasped directly. The human mind functions through content. To see, it needs an object. To hear, a sound. To think, a thought. When it encounters emptiness, that is, the absence of content, this mechanism is suspended. The mind cannot directly conceive a state in which there is absolutely nothing. Therefore, it can only think of nothingness indirectly, usually as the absence or lack of something. Language reflects this same mental structure. It is a system built upon what exists. Words point to things that have been experienced or, at the very least, can be imagined. Even the most abstract concepts carry some form of content. The word nothing itself often preserves, in the background, the idea that something could have been there. For instance, when we say there is no one in the room, the concept of a person is still present in our minds. We merely state that this concept is not instantiated in that particular space. This shows that even when nothingness is expressed through language, it remains indirectly connected to being. Consequently, nothingness cannot exist as an independent concept within language. It is always dependent on something else. In this sense, nothingness becomes not a reality in itself, but a definition of lack that is contingent upon being. This, in turn, renders its ontological status ambiguous. Is nothingness truly something? Or is it merely a mode of thinking? From a philosophical perspective, attempts to define nothingness often produce paradoxes. For if nothingness can be defined, this implies that the definition provides some form of knowledge about it. Yet anything that becomes an object of knowledge acquires, at least on the level of thought, a form of existence. At this point, nothingness turns into its own opposite the moment it is defined. In other words, once nothingness becomes thinkable, it ceases to be absolute nothingness. This is the most fundamental paradox of nothingness. The moment we think it, we negate it. For this reason, some philosophers argue that nothingness cannot be approached directly, but only as a boundary concept. Boundary concepts are not objects that can be directly defined. Rather, they indicate the point at which thought can no longer proceed. In this sense, nothingness represents the moment where explanation collapses, where conceptualization fails, and where thought reaches its limits. Scientific thinking also struggles to address nothingness directly. This is because science operates on phenomena that are observable, measurable, and testable. For something to be scientifically examined, it must produce some form of interaction. Absolute nothingness, by definition, produces no interaction whatsoever. For this reason, science can only approach nothingness indirectly. Even what is referred to in physics as empty space is not truly nothing. It is filled with energy fluctuations, fields, potentials, and virtual particles. In this context, nothingness in science often refers to states that are not yet measured, not interacting, or unknown. However, none of these expressions correspond to absolute nothingness. This explains why nothingness cannot be scientifically defined. Science, by its very nature, can only speak about things. Throughout history, certain traditions of thought have attempted to treat nothingness as a principle as real as being itself. Particularly in some Eastern philosophies and mystical traditions, nothingness has been interpreted as a point of origin, a transitional state, or a potential field. Yet even these approaches have not treated nothingness as an independent reality. Rather, they have used it as a conceptual tool for explaining being. Nothingness has often been conceived as a ground from which things may emerge. This indicates that nothingness is not an absolute state, but a product of the human mind's effort to create meaning. Human beings name the point they cannot explain as nothingness. This naming does not solve the problem. It merely marks a boundary. In this way, nothingness points not to the unknown, but to the unknowable. In spiritual systems of thought, the indefinability of nothingness is often associated with the limitations of human understanding. From this perspective, nothingness represents a domain that cannot be fully encompassed by human knowledge. Rather than offering definitive judgments, this domain encourages humility, urging individuals to restrain their claims and to acknowledge that knowledge is not absolute. Thus, nothingness ceases to be a sign of ignorance and becomes an indication of the limits of knowledge itself. In this sense, nothingness is not a threat to thought but a warning. It reminds us that not everything can be comprehended, not every question can be answered, and not everything can be defined. This reminder makes thought more modest and more cautious. In conclusion, the problem of the definability of nothingness represents a point at which human thought confronts its own tools. The more one attempts to define nothingness, the more the validity of the definition dissolves. For every definition attributes being, whereas nothingness rejects such attribution. For this reason, nothingness gains meaning not as an object that can be defined, but as a boundary where definition itself becomes impossible. For the human mind, nothingness generates more questions than answers. It appears where thought can no longer advance and compels us to reflect more deeply on what existence is, how knowledge is possible, and upon which foundations meaning rests. In this sense, nothingness is not an end, but a conceptual threshold.